Hello, everyone. This is a Russian Prince Conference in cooperation with Azov Museum from Russia, Rostov region. And today we are going to talk about Peter Lacy, a Russian commander, a Russian Imperial Army commander from Ireland. We shall start. I want to introduce you, Evgeny Mamichev, who is the director of Azov Museum, and he will talk about the museum and the battle in Azov. This meeting is in English, but we will summarize some translation into Russian. And if anybody wants to ask a question, please do, and we will help you to translate your question to the speaker. Evgeny, I'm going to make you the host of this meeting, and you can share the screen.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I start?
Just a second, you have to share your screen.
Yes, to start the presentation, to start the slideshow.
Of course, yes, please do.
Okay, I understand. Okay, I'm very glad to see you all at this meeting. Actually, the personality of Peter Lacy is very important for Azov, for the Museum of Azov, and our scientists make quite a few explorations about the period which encompasses the capture of Azov by the troops commanded by Peter Lacy. And today I'm going to give you quite detailed information how the troops under the command of Peter Lacy captured Azov back in 1736. I think, Anastasia, you blocked the demonstration of my screen. I cannot start it. Could you please?
Just a second.
Yeah, I think that.
Okay, I made you host here.
All right, that's better, right? Okay, just a moment. Okay, can you see the presentation now?
Yes.
Oh, can you see Field Marshal Lacy?
Yes.
Okay, very good, very good. All right, it is diligence, talent, success, and military skill of Peter Lacy that led him to Azov, the famous city that Peter the Great himself besieged and conquered 40 years before. In the war of 1735-1739, Russia sought to overcome the consequences of the humiliating for Russia Prut Treaty of 1711, to get back the fortress of Azov, to ensure the protection of its lands against the raids from Crimea, and to attain the exit to the southern seas. It was a continuation of the policy of Peter the Great, who had taken Azov back in 1696, but later lost it. По-русски нужно, да, здесь коротко сказать?
Да, пожалуйста.
Да. Ну вот мы говорим о том, что именно усердие, талант и успех Петра Петровича Ласи привели его к Азову, знаменитому городу, который до этого за 40 лет Петр I взял у Османской империи, одержал славную победу, но позже в результате Прутского похода вынужден был уступить османам снова Азов, но вот суждено было господину Лейси восстановить справедливость и отвоевать вновь победу Петра I. Это очень важный момент, потому что мы вступили в 2022 год, когда в России отмечается 350-летие со дня рождения Петра I, согласно указу президента, а господин Лейси стал служить России при Петре, и поэтому это очень интересное такое начало года и начало нашей совместной работы с личностью Питера Лейси. I emphasize that Peter Lacy started his service in Russian Empire, in Russian state under Peter the Great, and this year, 2022, according to the decree of Russian President Mr. Putin, we celebrate the 350th anniversary from the birth of Peter the First, and big events are planned for throughout Russia. And our reference to the personality of Peter Lacy is very relevant and appropriate in these conditions. Okay, so we go on. General Field Marshal Burkhard Christoph Munich was appointed commander-in-chief of all ground forces in that war. Munich wrote, in 1736, we would get back Azov, as well as other domains on the Don River and the area between the Don and the Dnieper along the Black Sea, and maybe Crimea itself will belong to us. In St. Petersburg, the country leadership thought of limiting themselves to the siege of Azov. Until Azov finally became Russian, it would have been impossible to stay in the Crimea. Munich developed the disposition of the upcoming campaign and the siege of the Turkish fortress of Azov. The command of the troops and the leadership of the operation at Azov was entrusted to Field Marshal Lacy, and before his arrival, to General Levashov. On the 19th of March, Munich approached Azov at a distance of 6 kilometers and set up a camp. Ну, мы здесь говорим о том, что вообще-то командование операции изначально было поручено генералу-фельдмаршалу Миниху, и Миних управлял всей операцией в целом на Причерноморском театре боевых действий, но Миних, в свою очередь, доверил операцию по взятию Азова фельдмаршалу Лейси, ну, как мы его называем, фельдмаршалу Ласи. Ну, а в ожидании прибытия фельдмаршала Ласи руководил войсками генерал Левашов. On the 20th and the 21st of March, the two Kalanchas were taken. They were Turkish towers that stood on both banks of the Don, 3 kilometers upstream from Azov. On the 23rd of March, Russian troops took the fortress of Lutik, located north of Azov, on the arm of the Don branch Мертвый Донец. Уже 20-21 марта произошел захват двух турецких башен Каланчей, которые находились чуть выше по Дону, в 3 километрах примерно от крепости Азов. А также была захвачена крепость Лютик. Если Азов находится на южной стороне дельты, то Лютик стоял на северной стороне дельты. On the 24th of March, Lieutenant General Vasily Levashov arrived near Azov. Munich made a reconnaissance of the fortress, showing Levashov how to conduct further actions against Azov, and provided Levashov with detailed instructions. Ну, Миних на начальном этапе руководил войсками, подготовил всю операцию, все начальные, скажем так, стадии и проинструктировал Левашова, временного командующего, до прибытия Ласи, что ему необходимо делать. On the 26th of March, Field Marshal Munich went to the main army in the Ukraine to lead the campaign against Crimea. The troops that surrounded Azov built 2 camps to the east and west of the fortress, surrounded by retrenchments. Redoubts, redans, flushes were built between the camps. Powerful Russian cannons placed on the redoubts fired at Azov. Ну, здесь мы говорим о мощной подготовке к взятию крепости, начало строительства не фортификационных, вернее, а сооружений, необходимых для атаки на крепость. On the 4th of May 1736, Peter Lacy, who had just received the rank of Field Marshal, arrived near Azov to take command of the siege corps. Heading towards Azov, Lacy was attacked by the Tatars in the steppes. Having lost 20 people of the convoy out of 40 and part of the property, Lacy barely escaped the capture. On the day of arrival, Lacy examined the location of the Russian troops, made a reconnaissance of the environs of Azov, the location of the enemy, and ordered to throw 7 mortar bombs on Azov. The Turks responded with increased firing. Когда Лейси двигался в Азов, он был атакован крымской татарской конницей. Дело в том, что путь к Азову — это сплошные степи, и здесь действительно царили в составе Крымского ханства, и здесь действительно царили татарские конвои, которые, вот с одним из которых и столкнулись те, кто сопровождал Лейси, он сам, но, к счастью, отбились от этого нападения, потеряв несколько человек, но, тем не менее, Лейси прибыл, как ему и предназначалось, на место осады Азова и провел разведку, и даже поручил несколько бомб запустить в крепость, чтобы понять, как отвечают турки, находящиеся в осаде. Lacy reported to the military collegium that Azov is in a solid state, and judging by the daily artillery fire from the fortress and sorties of the garrison, it is keeping itself well. In the Russian siege corps, when examined by Lacy, problems were identified in the condition of the troops, uniforms, monetary and food allowances, but the large number of Russian troops and weapons made it possible to hope for the capture of the fortress, especially since Rear Admiral Brudal arrived with several galleys on the same day with Lacy to the Kalancha towers near Azov. Ну, надо сказать, что Лейси сразу понял, что осада не будет очень простой, потому что турки хорошо укрепили крепость, и он докладывал военной коллегии, что Азов находится в твердом состоянии. И, судя по ежедневной активной артиллерийской стрельбе, себя содержит достаточно неплохо. Также Лейси, как профессиональный военный, оценил состояние войск, обмундирование, денежное, продуктовое довольствие, но он также сделал вывод, что достаточно большое количество войск, которое имелось российских, и неплохое вооружение, надеялись на взятие крепости. Тем более, что несколько галер подошло под командованием контр-адмирала Бридала к Каланчам, и были готовы также они подойти и к самой крепости. Carrying out the general plan of the campaign, Lacy immediately began to conduct a gradual attack against Azov. After a thorough reconnaissance on the 5th of May by engineering officers under the leadership of Quartermaster General de Brigny, it was decided to start attacks from two sides: the real attacks on the western front of the fortress, the demonstrative attacks on the eastern front, on the Alexeyevsky Hornwork. Ну, надо сказать, что крепость была неплохо защищена, и она видна сейчас на слайде. Есть крепостца Петровская, это на другом стороне Дона, а на другой стороне Дона, а на южном берегу Дона вот сама крепость, Горнверк, построенный специальный, и поэтому Лейси прибег к хитрости. Он запустил атаку демонстративную на восточной части крепости, а настоящую атаку запланировал на западной части крепости. Siege artillery was transported from the ships of Azov, and on the 6th of May, they began to build the approaches. To reduce the number of unarmed soldiers, the guns of the sick were given to those who did not have them. They were given money and food for 3 months. К Азову подвезли осадную артиллерию, и 6 мая стали сооружать опроши, чтобы уменьшить число безоружных солдат. Ружья больных отдавали тем, у кого их не было. Выдали деньги и продовольствие сразу на 3 месяца. Thanks to the repeated orders of Field Marshal Lacy, the siege corps near Azov increased in number. By the day of the surrender of Azov, there were at least 25,000 Russian troops, not counting artillerymen, engineering troops and Cossacks. The increase in numbers made it possible to carry out large-scale fortification work. Batteries were set up in the defensive fences from which siege guns fired at the fortress. Лейси сконцентрировался на том, чтобы повышать количество атакующих людей, но до того, как они приступили именно к своей военной работе, они строили сооружения, необходимые для осады, то есть осадные такие опроши создавали, и вот это большое количество людей, это было важно для Лейси. Он к концу осады где-то 25 тысяч человек собрал под стенами крепости, вот позволило с инженерной точки зрения правильно организовать осаду Азова. On the 8th of May, the Turks from Azov made a sortie. 300 cavalry and 500 foot janissaries attacked 150 grenadiers on the left flank of the siege line. After a stubborn skirmish, the Turks retreated with losses. Ну, надо сказать, что в истории крепости Азов и ее осад всегда имели место вылазки, ну, не только, наверное, этой крепости, многих других, потому что крепость была построена таким образом, что она позволяла делать такие вылазки. Я позже скажу об этом. 8 мая турки вот произвели эту вылазку, и 300 конных и 500 пеших янычар обрушились на 150 гренадеров на левом фланге осадной линии. После упорной стычки турки с потерями отступили. This sortie was the reason for Lacy's order that if a skirmish happened again, all the officers and soldiers should stand to the last man. Ну, уже я говорил о том, что Ласи оценил операцию как сложную, и вот такие вылазки, они были очень опасны, поэтому он приказал всем стоять до последнего в случае такой вылазки. On the 9th of May, Rear Admiral Bredal arrived at Azov with galleys and 9 special flat-bottomed ships, prams, on which there were over 200 guns. Lacy entrusted Bredal with taking measures to ensure that boats could not leave Azov fortifications. Lacy ordered that part of the flotilla be directed along the arms of the Don to its mouth and take a position there as to not to allow reinforcements from the sea to Azov. Bredal sent 6 small prams to the mouth. It turned out to be very timely. The Turkish fleet indeed arrived at the Sea of Azov to support the besieged fortress. The shallow water of the mouth of the River Don did not allow the fleet to enter the river, and the position occupied by the Russian flotilla made it impossible for Turks to send reinforcements on boats. Without doing anything, the Turkish fleet retreated. Ну, надо сказать, что еще Петр I обжегся на взятии крепости в 1695 году. Он пришел и не смог ее взять, несмотря на огромное численное превосходство. И основной причиной, он сам ее обозначил, это отсутствие флота. Поэтому на следующий год Петр повелел строить корабли. Корабли были построены, и крепость Азов взяли в 1696 году. Но прозвучало потом на Боярском соборе морским судам быть. И вот Лейси, что опять важно, да, в год юбилея Петра I, Лейси, он учел опыт Петра I, и когда он организовывал осаду, он направил большие корабли, в том числе вот такие большие прамы, для того, чтобы контролировать подход к крепости со стороны Азовского моря, потому что турецкие корабли, они могли войти в море, а крепости подойти не могли из-за того, что река очень мелкая, и к крепости должны были подходить небольшие суда. Ну, а небольшим судам, конечно же, вот такие огромные прамы, галеры, они не давали возможности подойти, и поэтому крепость оказалась в осаде со всех сторон, со стороны суши и со стороны моря. On the 16th of May, the Turks again made a sortie to hinder a work on the left bank of offensive line. The sortie, made by a 2,000-strong cavalry and foot detachments, supported by increased rifle fire, was at first a success. Only the arrival of Field Marshal Lacy with 500 foot and mounted grenadiers and 100 dragoons, with whom he undertook a detour of the sortie detachment, forced the Turks to retreat. Rifle and cannon fire lasted 5 hours. Both sides suffered significant losses. Вот 16 мая турки предприняли еще одну вылазку, и на том этапе более мощную, около 2000 кавалеристов и также пеших военных под прикрытием огня. Сначала им удалось продвинуться, но тем не менее Ласи с помощью драгун, с помощью гренадеров, он смог обойти эту вылазку и нанести им мощный удар, заставив отступить, но потери были понесены. As a result, the Russian retained the taken line, where a battery was built on the same day. On the 31st of May, the Russians opened increased fire from all guns at the Azov fortress. In order to fire at Azov from all sides, including from the river, Lacy ordered Bredal to place 6 prams above Azov on the Don at such a distance from the city that it was possible to destroy the walls and batteries of the fortress with ship artillery. The guns from the ships successfully fired at Azov until its surrender. Но тут очень важно, что Ласи руководил операцией со всех сторон, находил возможности. В частности, он адмирала Бредала направил не только контролировать подходы для того, чтобы не дать усилить крепость, но еще и использовал прамы для артиллерийского обстрела гарнизона крепости и ее стен, поставив эти прамы чуть выше по Дону. The Turks defended themselves very hard. On the 3rd of June, they once again made a successful sortie this time against the Russians on the left flank. The besiegers began to retreat. Field Marshal Lacy, having collected the nearest pickets and reserves, with 200 cavalry dragoons, stopped the further advance of the Turks. A Turkish post near the suburb was captured. Lacy ordered that a battery be built there. The fighting on the left flank of the siege fortifications was especially fierce. The Turks tried with all their might to destroy the Russian battery. They fired heavily, made sorties. During a sortie on June the 4th, 40 Turks and 17 Russians were killed. 104 Russians were wounded. Field Marshal Lacy was wounded in the leg. Ну, здесь речь идет еще об одной вылазке, которую турки предприняли, и она была достаточно успешной. Вот, и Ласи должен был предпринять достаточно большое количество усилий и понести опять определенные жертвы, чтобы отбить эту вылазку и укрепиться на линии, которая была достигнута. On the 8th of June, a powder magazine exploded from a successfully launched Russian bomb. The explosion destroyed 5 mosques, more than 100 houses, 300 people were killed. The siege works of the Russians had already reached the earthen defensive walls. Field Marshal Lacy, in order to accelerate the fall of the fortress, decided to take the fence with an open attack. Ну вот, после такой мощной подготовки и боевых столкновений Ласи все-таки решил усилить обстрел. Обстрел прошел достаточно успешно, взорвался пороховой погреб в крепости, и это очень большой урон нанесло внутренней части цитадели. Было разрушено сразу 5 мечетей, больше 100 домов, и несколько сотен людей было убито. Чтобы быстрее взять крепость, Ласи решил начать открытую атаку. On the night of the 17th and 18th of June, 300 grenadiers and 700 musketeers under the command of Colonel Lohman attacked the defensive fence. The Turks stubbornly defended themselves, blew up 2 mines, but had to retreat. The outskirts of Azov were taken. The next day, Pasha Mustafa Aga of Azov sent a letter to the Russians with a proposal to surrender the city. The fire from the Russian siege guns was stopped. Ну, конечно, вот такая мощная артиллерийская канонада и предшествующие этому сражения, они привели к тому, что и, соответственно, по команде Ласси начатая атака привели к тому, что паша турецкий Мустафа Ага серьезно задумался о сдаче крепости и направил письмо соответствующему командованию российских войск. At the beginning of the negotiations, Field Marshal Lacy insisted that the garrison should surrender, but the commandant of the Azov fortress did not agree and said that it would be better to die with the entire garrison under the ruins of the fortress. But in the end, they agreed. The city of Azov is handed over to Her Imperial Majesty. The garrison was to leave the fortress without military honors and under Russian escort, to be taken to the Turkish fortress of Atsuk with the condition not to fight against Russia for a year. The military was allowed to keep personal weapons in the amount of 1 gun, pistol, bow, or sword. And all artillery, its accessories and provisions, powder magazines were transferred to the winner. The Turkish garrison was given provisions for the journey to Atsuk. Ну, в конце концов, после долгих споров, все-таки командование гарнизона приняло решение о сдаче. Было решено, что город переходит в подданство ее императорского величества. Гарнизон выходит из крепости без боевых почестей и под русским конвоем будет отведен в турецкую крепость Ацук с условием в течение года не служить против России. Военным разрешалось оставить личное оружие в количестве одного ружья, пистолета, лука, сабли. Вся артиллерия, принадлежности, артиллерийские и провианские запасы, пороховые погреба передавались победителю. Турецкому гарнизону был дан провиант только на время следования к крепости Азов. On the 20th of June, 4 Turkish officers arrived at the Russian camp to sign the final terms of surrender and handed Field Marshal Lacy with respect the keys to Azov on a silver platter. The scene of handing over the keys of Azov to Field Marshal Lacy is depicted on the plan for the capture of Azov in 1736. In the report to the State Military Collegium, Field Marshal Lacy wrote, on the 20th of June, with the highest happiness and glorious weapons and brave soldiers, the city of Azov, as a considerable state profit, is received in her Imperial Majesty's possession, without great harm or loss. Ну, надо сказать, что вот передача ключей от гарнизона победителям, она всегда проходила так церемониально. Вот здесь на плане показано о том, как происходит такая церемония. Это 4 турецких офицера прибыли в русский лагерь, подписали окончательные условия сдачи и вручили ключи фельдмаршалу Ласси с почтением на серебряном блюде. Сцена вручения вот здесь изображена на плане взятия крепости. В рапорте Государственной военной коллегии фельдмаршал Ласси написал: 20 июня высочайшим счастьем и славным оружием и храбрым солдат поступком город Азов с немалым государственным прибытком, высокомонаршее ее императорское величество, подданство без великого вреда и убытка получен. The following day, part of the Russian troops, 3,200 people, occupied the Alexeyevsky hornwork of the Azov fortress as a garrison. On 27th June, all Russian troops entered the city. The Turkish garrison left the Azov fortress. 119 prisoners were released. Вот на следующий день после передачи ключей, подписания всех формальностей, 3200 человек заняли в качестве гарнизона Алексеевский горнер, это восточная часть Азовской крепости. 27 июня все русские войска уже вошли в город, и турецкий гарнизон покинул Азовскую крепость, и было освобождено 119 пленных человек. For the capture of Azov, all the troops participating in the siege, officers and lower ranks, were awarded a 2 months' salary. Having occupied the Azov fortress, Lacy rested his army for 35 days before going to Crimea. He destroyed all his siege work around Azov, left the siege artillery in service of the fortress. As garrison in Azov, 1 dragoon and 4 infantry regiments were left. After receiving the order of Empress Anna Ivanovna, the troops set off from Azov to Crimea. On the 2nd of August, 1736, a column of march under the direct command of Lacy set out from Azov. Ну вот надо сказать, что Азов, конечно же, не был конечной целью России на том этапе. Конечной целью было овладеть Крымом, поэтому Азов был взят как крепость, открывающая дорогу, путь на Крым. И за взятие Азова все войска, участвующие в осаде, были награждены 2-месячным окладом. Заняв крепость, Ласси на 35 дней дал отдых своей армии перед походом на Крым. Он уничтожил все свои осадные работы вокруг Азова, оставил осадную артиллерию на вооружение крепости. И гарнизоном в Азове были оставлены 1 драгунский и 4 пехотных полка. Он получил повеление императрицы Анны Иоанновны, и после получения этого повеления войска отправились из Азова на Крым. 2 августа 1736 года колонна под командованием Ласси выступила из Азова на Крым. The capture of the Azov fortress was of strategic importance for Russia. Russia received the fortress at the mouth of the Don and access to the Sea of Azov. Вот говоря о значении этой победы, надо отметить, что взятие Азовской крепости, оно, конечно же, имело огромное значение, и Россия получала контроль над дельтой реки Дон, над выходом в Азовское море, и соответствующим образом могла пользоваться результатами, плодами этой победы. То есть выход в Азовское море, к чему стремились вот в результате этой тактической работы, он был получен. The activities of Field Marshal Lacy during the siege and capture of Azov in 1736 received favorable reviews from all military experts. In the Azov campaign, Lacy showed his energy, diligence, personal courage, and concern for the troops subordinate to him. The field marshal took charge of the siege of Azov when no plan of attack had yet been worked out. Peter Lacy drew up a plan according to the situation and energetically carried it out. During the siege of Azov, Lacy successfully combined the actions of the siege corps and the flotilla. Empress Anna Ivanovna awarded Peter Lacy with the Order of the Holy Apostle Andrew for faithful and diligent service on the 5th of March 1737. Надо сказать, что деятельность Петра Ласси при осаде Азова была признана военными экспертами, получила очень хорошие отзывы. Он, по их мнению, он правильно организовал осадные работы и всю осаду и понес минимальные требуемые потери. И была отмечена храбрость его личная и забота о подчиненных ему войсках. Дело в том, что фельдмаршал принял руководство осады Азова, когда не было еще выработано плана этой атаки. Ласси составил план, соответственно, обстановке и достаточно энергично привел его в исполнение. В ходе осады Азова Ласси удачно совместил действия осадного корпуса и флотилии. Императрица Анна Иоанновна наградила Петра Ласси орденом святого апостола Андрея Первозванного за верную и родительную службу 5 марта 1737 года. The siege of Azov in 1736 left many traces in the land of the city. Archaeologists of the Azov Museum Reserve constantly find material evidence of those events. Fragments of siege trenches and other structures have been discovered. Bullets, cannonballs, parts of military ammunition, a hoard of coins of 1736 were found. The remains of bread ovens were excavated in which bread was baked for the soldiers of the siege army. Fragments of soldiers' bowls, cups, ceramics of that time were discovered. Many mass graves of 1736 were found in different districts of the central part of the city. In one of the burials, a ring was found depicting the scene of Solomon's judgment. Ну, вот здесь на слайдах видно артефакты того периода. Дело в том, что осада Азова 1736 года оставила много следов в земле Азова. Наши археологи Азовского музея-заповедника постоянно находят материальные свидетельства этих событий. Открыты фрагменты осадных траншей, найдены пули, ядра, детали воинской амуниции, клады монет, раскопаны остатки хлебных печей, в которых пекли хлеб для солдат осадной армии, обнаружены фрагменты солдатских мисок, чашек, керамики того времени. Найдено множество братских захоронений 1736 года в разных частях центрального района города. В одном из погребений был даже найден перстень с изображением сцены суда Соломона. The largest find from the siege of 1736 is an underground passage excavated in 2015. The underground passage was explored over a large area, which made it possible to obtain new information about the design features of the underground passages in Azov. Вот здесь очень интересная находка. Это она, пожалуй, самая масштабная. Это подземный ход, раскопанный в 2015 году. Дело в том, что местное население в Азове очень много говорит и вспоминает о когда-то о имеющихся, скорее всего, по их мнению, на территории крепости подземных ходах. Но найти их не удается достаточно часто, потому что центр города застроен. Так вот, в 2015 году был найден вот один из таких подземных ходов, и он относится именно к осаде Азова 1736 года, когда крепость осаждала армия под командованием Ласси. The exposition of Azov Museum Reserve contains copies of engravings of the 18th century, a plan for the capture of Azov with the explosion of powder magazines and scenes of the Turks handing the keys of Azov to the Russian commanders, the pictures that were previously shown in the slideshow. And archaeological finds from the siege of Azov in 1736 are also presented in our museum. Но надо сказать, что в экспозиции Азовского музея представлены находки 1736 года, и здесь у нас и план взятия Азова, есть изображение штурма Азовской крепости со взрывом порохового погреба, сцены вручения турками ключей от Азова командующему. И представлены археологические находки, другие археологические находки периода осады. И вот здесь, конечно, очень важно отметить, что у нас сохраняется и сама крепость. It is very important to note that the fortress itself, which existed in 1736, is remaining in the modern city of Azov. Эта крепость является объектом показа, и сегодня ее посещают музейные посетители. It is open to the museum visitors, and we have around 200,000 museum visitors every year in Azov, and a majority of them who visit Azov during the summertime, during the good weather, can go up the ramparts of the fortress. This is how the fortress looks from the air. You can see the parts of the bastions remaining, still remaining in Azov, and this is these are the bastions, exactly remaining bastions which were attacked by the troops commanded by Peter Lacy. This is the main building of our museum, where you can find the exposition dedicated to the history of Azov in the 18th century, including the siege of Azov by the Russian troops commanded by Peter Lacy. Ну вот здесь наше основное здание музея, расположенное в центре города Азова, где хранится основная экспозиция. Эта экспозиция включает множество артефактов, в том числе и артефакты 18 столетия и в частности событий 1736 года, когда крепость Азов была взята русскими войсками под командованием Ласи. Well, that will be all from me. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, I am ready to answer them.
Thank you so much, Evgeny. That was really very interesting and quite fascinating. And my roots are from Don. I'm quite impressed that an Irishman was leading Don's Cossacks. Does anybody want to ask some questions to Evgeny, or particularly about their battle in Azov, or we can discuss life of Lacy later all together? Or any questions, you're welcome to.
I'll ask a question.
Yes.
The surrender seems to have been carried out in a rather, civilized way. And was that typical of the time? A kind of gentleman's agreement to let people leave peacefully?
I would say so, because 40 years before, in 1696, when Peter I's army finally captured Azov, there was also a gentleman's, as you called it, agreement, where all the military actions were stopped by signing a document, a treaty of capitulation, a treaty of surrender. So, well, formally, yes, it was surrendered in a peaceful way, but we should also carry in mind that it was preceded by heavy cannonades and heavy fighting with a lot of victims, especially the first campaign by Peter I in 1695, when Peter did not manage to take the fortress, the fortress could stand. And even 50 years before that, when the Cossacks was taken by the fortress, was taken by the Don Cossacks and from the Ottoman Empire, and later the Ottomans came to take it back, but could not do it. And for 4 months there were heavy fightings, and lots of lives were lost at that time. But if we take into consideration the campaign of 1736, when Lacy commanded over the siege of Azov, the number of casualties was not so great, and I think it is Lacy's talent which brought the Russians to this result. I think this does not quite this does not happen very often in the military history, but I think it is the greatest result during the military history when something is accomplished and the number of victims, number of casualties is not very big. It's not great. So I think the Lacy's professionalism is was absolutely confirmed during this battle.
Thank you, Evgeny. I think we will move on, and I would like to introduce Cornelius O'Sullivan, Historical Society of Ireland, and he will tell us about Lacy's family, why Lacy, Peter Lacy, ended up outside in Russia. What forced him to leave Ireland? Cornelius, do you want me to make you a host? Do you want to share any pictures with us?
No, thank you.
Okay, that's okay. Just then. You're welcome.
Good morning, everyone, from West Limerick, the home of Lacy. Where I am at the moment is a few minutes from where Lacy was born, in a parish called Killeedy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So from very humble beginnings to the successful career in Russia, Peter Lacy, we call him Peter Lacy, came from a parish called Killeedy in County Limerick. Now it's a small parish in Munster, so it will be Midwest of Ireland and overlooked by the Mullaghmurriach Mountains. Now today is a very important day for Killeedy, for Ireland in general, the 15th of January, because the patron saint of Killeedy is Saint Ita. And today, 15th of January, is her feast day. So it's a great day to have the conference on Anastasia. And Saint Ita, she would have died in 570 roughly. And she is venerated in both the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. So for all of us, it's a kind of a good day to be talking about Lacy and Killeedy. So Killeedy is a parish in Ireland, in Limerick. And it contains two villages, Ashford and Rahina, and a very, very quiet beginning. So I suppose from the noise of siege warfare in Azov, going right back to the humble beginnings, very quiet area in West Limerick. It's a very rich story that, while it might have its origins in Ireland, I think it's a worldwide story really, because it's part of the wild geese, which is a big story, as everyone probably knows here better than I do. The Lacy family would have originally come to Ireland with the Normans as part of the Norman invasion. For example, the first recordings of Lacy family members in West Limerick, we'll say, would have been in Brewery, and that was in the 1200s, so early 13th century they would have come over. And from Brewery then they would have moved west to Killeedy, which is where Peter was born. So we're talking from the early 13th century, you know, which is where the Lacy family chronicles would have begun. Now, I suppose the interesting thing about Lacy, from our perspective, is he was a member of the Wild Geese, and possibly, as far as I know, the youngest member of the Wild Geese. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But the Irish have a tradition of exporting, I suppose exporting might be the wrong word, but soldiers abroad. For example, in the 1587, 1588 period, we would have had Irish soldiers serving in Spain under Tercio Stanley, and they would have been fighting in Flanders. Then after the flight of the Earls, which was in 1607, thousands of Irishmen would have fled Ireland as well. and you're talking about famine and war-ravaged landscapes. So a lot of young men having no hopes, no futures here in Ireland, they decided to travel to Europe, and including my own family members, O'Sullivans, they would have traveled to Spain and France, and to this very day there's lots of them out there. Then the next, a lot of people think that de Lacy would have been the first of the Irish to fight in Russia or for Russian service. Actually, I have already written an article about Irish men fighting for Russian service in the 1630s. So 60 years before the Siege of Limerick, which I will be talking to you in a moment about. So in the 1630s, 1640s, there would have been Irishmen serving Russia in wars. During the 1640s, then 1650s, we had the Cromwellian wars here in Ireland, or 11-year war in Ireland. And that would have ravaged our landscape as well. And so that would have been another mass exodus of young Irishmen to fight in countries abroad. And I suppose where Peter Lacy's story begins would have been the Siege of Limerick. But to give you context of the Siege of Limerick, which took place in 1690, 1691, this was part of a war that involved 3 kings and 1 pope. So we had King William, King James, King Louis XIV of France, and the Pope at the time. And they were all vying for political and military control, not of Ireland, but of the English crown, and also to become the superpower in Europe. So while some of the major engagements did take place here in Ireland, its origin wasn't in Ireland. William of Orange would have taken the crown of England, and of course James II wanted to take that crown back, and he thought that by using Ireland as a stepping stone, or as a backdoor, they called it, during the Second World War, into the UK or England at the time, it would have been ideal to start here. So with the support of France, Louis XIV, they sent thousands of soldiers to Ireland, and the War of the 3 Kingdoms, as it's often referred to, begun. We had major battles in Aughrim, Carrickfergus. We would have had the Siege of Limerick, of course, the Battle of the Boyne. For anyone looking, I suppose, to look at the political landscape, the religious landscape here in Ireland, especially in Northern Ireland, a knowledge of the 1690 campaigns would be very, very important, because we're still facing the consequences to this very day. It's 2022, and we still hear, mention of the Jacobite Wars or Williamite Wars, which is what they were referred to. Was it a religious war? Not necessarily, because you would have had a lot of Catholics on both sides, Protestants on both sides, and in fact at the Battle of the Boyne, it is well known that the Williamite forces, which involved Danish troops, were actually supplied a lot of muskets, flint firing muskets, which would have been better than what the Jacobites had, by the Pope. So it's, religion wasn't a major cause of it. It was political. It was to take back the crown of England. That was the major reason.
I just translate or just summarize something what you are saying to our Russian listeners who have difficulties with. I won't take that long. It will be just summarize translation. Корнелиус О'Сулливан приветствовал всех из графства Лимерик. Это родина Питера Лейси. Питер Лейси принадлежал семье, которая появилась в Ирландии с нашествием норманнов в XII веке. Они прошли, в принципе, через всю страну на запад и остановились в графстве Лимерик. Питер Лейси вынужден был покинуть Ирландию в достаточно юном возрасте, в 13 лет, и в составе Wild Geese, это дикие гуси в прямом переводе, это группа ирландских военных, которые вынуждены были покинуть Ирландию, принять участие в военных действиях, воевав за другие страны. Он позже обещал побольше об этом рассказать. Корнелиус начал рассказывать о тому, что предшествовало отъезду семьи Ласси. Это война 3 королей, Вильяма, Джеймса. По был вовлечен в это, когда шла война за контроль над английской колонией, английской короной, королевством, правильно сказать. Yes, thank you, Cornelius. Yeah.
Thank you, Anastasia. My West Limerick accent is difficult for everyone.
No worries. Yeah.
So I suppose one of the final acts of the Jacobite Wars, or Williamite Wars, whichever you wish to call them, was the Siege of Limerick. And there's an event that we do every year. It's called the Wild Geese, and it takes place on the actual grounds of the Siege of Limerick, which is King John's Castle in Limerick City. And every year we tell the story of the battle itself, the siege, and the participants. And of course, Peter Lacy himself was there, as was my own ancestor, Patrick O'Sullivan. So I like to think in my own imagination that they might have fought together. So you had the Jacobite forces in the city itself, and you had the Williamite forces outside the city. And it was laid siege during the Jacobite Wars on many occasions. So from 1689 to 1691, it would have been attacked on a regular basis. But the final siege was in 1691. And numbers involved, you're talking about Williamite forces of 25,000 soldiers and Jacobite forces inside the castle grounds of 14,000. Now, the last speaker would have spoken excellently about the siege of Azov. So that wouldn't have been Peter Lacy's first siege. He was actually 13 years of age when the siege of Limerick took place. So he was actually serving with the Prince of Wales regiment at the age of 13 years. He was an ensign, which meant he was in charge of the flag. And so I suppose maybe Philip had asked, was it a kind of a gentleman's agreement towards the end? Definitely, I think with that experience as a 13-year-old, you know, in the siege of Limerick, seeing how the treaty would have been discussed afterwards, the agreements would have been signed on the actual treaty stone, they say, in Limerick City, which you can still go and visit. Maybe a lot of that had an influence on him. He would have seen the horrors of war as a 13-year-old, so he didn't want a repeat of that. Now, there's an interesting, I was reading recently about Lacy chronicles here in Ireland and abroad, and there's an interesting quote now as to whether it is true or not is another story, but it sounds good, that when the treaty had been signed, so the Treaty of Limerick would have been signed in October 3rd, 1691, and Sarsfield, Patrick Sarsfield, which a lot of people would have heard of, and actually we're hoping to repatriate the remains of Patrick Sarsfield to Limerick City, hopefully this year or next year at the latest. So it's a very important event for us every year. It takes place in Limerick City in July. But one of the quotes that the Lacy Chronicles has is that as Peter Lacy was leaving, because there was an option for the Jacobite forces under the truce, under the treaty that was signed, to stay in Ireland or to leave and leave for France. So roughly 1,300 decided to stay in Ireland, but thousands actually left to join the forces of France and to try their fortunes in Europe. And of course, this became part of the story of the Wild Geese, Flight of the Wild Geese. But as Patrick Lacy was leaving Limerick City, there was a comment passed by one of the English soldiers. And the comment was, "Off you go, boy, with your rags and your raggedy army." So here were some Williamite soldiers that were laughing, mocking a 13-year-old who had survived the siege of Limerick. And of course, I suppose you would have been left with rags on your back at that stage. But they were mocking a 13-year-old who would have gone on to change the face of Europe. I wonder, did they know that? Obviously not. But it's a very romantic story, but a very true story. So when the Treaty of Limerick was signed, the 3rd of October, 1691, as Peter Lacy, a 13-year-old, remember, I know what I was doing at 13 and wasn't sieges, thankfully, would have been horrified, would have been absolutely traumatized by what had happened, was leaving the gates of Limerick City to join all those flying wild geese, as they call them, to go to France, and he was being mocked and laughed at by the Williamite forces. And of course, the reference was, I just read it here, "Off you go, boy, with your rags and your raggedy army." And as I said, little did they know this was Peter Lacy who would have gone on to change the face of Europe. So I think it's a lovely story. do you wish to translate that?
Yes, please. Yes, thank you. Так начали о том, что война трех королей, и продвигался король Уильям вдоль Ирландии. Многие ирландские города, семьи были связаны с королем Джеймсом и не хотели смены власти, и им не нравилось, что такое произошло. Один из последних городов, который долго не сдавался, был Лимерик. И известно с 1690-1691 года, это известно как блокада Лимерика, Siege of Limerick. Так что Корнелиус сообщил после рассказа о битве за Азов, о блокаде Азова. Это уже была не первая блокада Питера. Он в возрасте 13 лет он принимал участие в блокаде Лимерика. У него была уже должность, он был ответственен за флаг. К сожалению, не устоял Лимерик, и согласно договоренностям, полученным с городом, воевавшие против Уильяма имели возможность покинуть Ирландию. Они могли остаться и могли покинуть. Около 1300 человек осталось, но тысячи и тысячи покинули. Так называли Flight of Wild Geese, полет диких гусей, как военные Ирландии, семьи, воевавшие с Уильямом, покинули Ирландию. В основном поехали во Францию служить Франции. Франция в это время поддерживала их в войне с Уильямом. И что интересно, что бы хотел обратить внимание Корнелиус, Питеру было только 13 лет, он был самым младшим участником этого движения диких гусей Wild Geese, и известно, он видел записи о том, что была некоторая насмешка и короля Уильяма о молодом, включая молодом Питере. Ну, давайте, мальчики, уезжайте, что у вас там, кто вас там ждет. И кто бы только знал, что Питер Лейси превратится в человека, который изменит карту Европы. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. So I suppose being born in 1678 in Killeedy, which is a very quiet parish in West Limerick, where I am right now, and to the siege of Limerick in 1691, to being mocked, being referred to as a raggedy boy of 13. His career spanned 50 years. Now there's people here a lot more aware of what he would have done in Russia, but from my own research, achieving a great rank of General Feld Marshal, he fought 31 campaigns, 18 battles, 18 sieges. His first was here in Limerick City. Every year, every July, we commemorate the siege of Limerick and Flight of the Wild Geese. So if anyone's ever thinking of coming to Ireland, come to Limerick. That's my bit of advertising. But he wasn't the first nor the last Irishman to serve in the Russian forces, and we have a rich tradition. If anytime I do talks like this in person or over the internet, a lot of people ask me about reading material. Now I know there's people here that have written articles and possibly books I'm not aware of, but if I could suggest, maybe there's one book. Can you see it okay? I'll read it out. It's Irish Soldiers in Europe. It's by George B. Clark. Yeah. And from memory, there's an entire chapter on Peter Lacy, chapter 12. So it's Irish Soldiers in Europe, 17th to the 19th century. It's by George Clark. So I'd highly recommend that book. I like the way it's written. Another book, which is written by a friend of mine, called The Irish Brigades Abroad, by Stephen McGarry. Stephen's a good friend of mine, and a magnificent book. It covers not just the Irish in the Russian service, but in Austrian service, in Spanish, in French. It's called Irish Brigades Abroad, from the Wild Geese to the Napoleonic Wars, by Stephen McGarry. And it's another good read as well, very easily digestible. And last but not least, a book that is quite informative. I read this, one of my first books, because again, I suppose being from Limerick, West Limerick, same as Peter Lacy, I was reared on stories of the siege of Limerick, of the Wild Geese. So as again, I suppose O'Sullivan's as well would have been part of the Wild Geese story. I would have been raised on reading materials like this. So this is called the Irish Brigade, 1670 to 1745, and that's by D.P. Graham, the Irish Brigade. Now that very much focuses on the Irish in French service, but for background of the 1690 siege of Limerick, 1691 siege of Limerick, you can't do much better than that. Now, as I said, there's probably a lot of other books out there that I haven't read, and articles as well, but those three quick come to mind, and I happen to have them here on my shelf. So from very humble beginnings in Killeedy, as I say, and today being the 15th of January is, I suppose Killeedy, I should have explained, comes from Irish Killeda, which is Church of Ita. Saint Ita is the patron of Killeedy. And today, the 15th of January, is her day, and she would have been venerated in the Catholic Church as well as the Orthodox Church. So, as I said, from very humble beginnings in West Limerick to Russia, a magnificent, rich story that's not just Irish, it's Russian, it's French, it's Spanish, it's a worldwide story, really, that we can all share and, I suppose, enjoy as well. So, any questions? Or
I'll just translate for your last few words. Должна заметить, что Корнелиус О'Сулливан, семья О'Сулливан тоже принимала участие в битве за Лимерик, в блокаде Лимерика. Корнелиус принимает активное участие в мероприятиях. Каждый год в июле проводятся мероприятия в честь блокады, Siege of Limerick, блокады Лимерика. Он приглашает в это время и в Ирландию, и в Лимерик поучаствовать. Также он напомнил, что Питер Лейси это не первый и не последний был ирландец, который воевал и за российскую армию, так и за европейские армии. Это была традиция, уже сложилась некоторая для ирландцев. И с 1630 года уже были ирландцы в российской армии. И Корнелиус рекомендует ознакомиться с книгами, которые он показывал, и авторов, книги на английском языке, которые ему понравились, легко читаются и дадут возможность представления об ирландцах, воевавших за другие страны. И непосредственно в книгах есть информация и о Питере Лейси, конечно. Если кто-то хочет задать вопросы, пожалуйста. Any questions to Cornelius, please?
Yes, I have some questions. First of all, I want to greet everybody because I was a little late, and Philip, I'm glad to see you. Yes. My name is Leonid Kudzevich, and I from St. Petersburg. I'm studying for Peter Lacy's biography and biographies of another Irishman who served in Russia in 18th and in their descendants in 19th century. And so I have a question. I've read in some places that Peter Lacy's father and uncle take part in the siege of Limerick and command some regiments, and possibly some of his brothers also. And but I saw only information that Peter Lacy's uncle was a wild geese, and Peter go to exile with him. And what about his father and another members of the family?
Thank you very much. Great question. Yes, his uncle was Lieutenant Colonel John Lacy from Kilmallock, which is West Limerick town as well. I'm talking about West Limerick quite a lot, but that's where they all came from. So he was Lieutenant Colonel, and he was involved in the defense of Limerick in 1691. Previous to that, he was an officer in France under Charles I, who was trying to reclaim his throne. He was made deputy governor of Limerick from 1685 to 1686. So that would have been Peter Lacy's uncle. His father, John Lacy, was from Ballingarry, again a West Limerick village, and he would have served also. And another uncle was Pierce. I don't have notes in front of me. Was Pierce Lacy, and he would have fought during the siege of Limerick as well. But he, unfortunately, was leading the attacks of the cavalry outside of the walls of Limerick, and so he would have been a very successful, what we would have called, rapparee. A rapparee would have been a guerrilla warfare specialist or forces. That's what they were called at the time. Previous to that, they were called Tories, which is where the Tory party got their name from, believe it or not. But Pierce Lacy, who would have been carrying out a lot of cavalry charges and attacks on the Williamite forces outside of the city of Limerick and the fortress of Limerick. When he tried to get through the gates of Limerick, unfortunately the timing was quite poor because the Williamite forces attacked at the same time. So the gates had to be closed. So that was Pierce Lacy, and he would have been related to Peter as well. In fact, again, from the top of my head, there was 27 people fighting in the siege of Limerick with the surname Lacy. So 27 Lacys involved, which is fascinating, really. There was obviously many other names as well, but that was one of the big ones, really, the Lacys. So 27 family and relatives involved in the siege of Limerick. And you are correct that his uncle was Lieutenant Colonel John Lacy. His father was John Lacy also. Grandfather was John Lacy from Bruff. So a lot of Johns, and his nephew was George Brown, which you probably know. And he would have served as a general in the Russian army and achieved great successes as well. So thank you for your question. I hope I answered it.
Thank you, yes.
Thank you.
So I probably misunderstood then. So the Peter Lacy left Ireland with his uncle, but what about his dad and brother? Did they stay in Ireland or did they go as well?
His father left with him.
All right.
And with regard to his brother, we don't have much information. Maybe others do have a lot of information on his brother, but I'm not aware of information. Pierce, unfortunately, didn't survive the battle.
Mm.
Yes, the question was about father because Peter Lacy, in his journal, he mentioned only his uncle and that he was dead after the battle in the northern Italy, and and it is only his relative that is mentioned in his journal. So it will be interesting what happened with his father.
Леонид, вы хотите продолжить, может быть, рассказ о Лейси, о ваших, может быть, каких-то находках и работах?
Да, я могу, наверное, коротко рассказать, как складывалась судьба Петра Ласи после его прибытия в Европу и в Россию. Ну, я, наверное, лучше буду говорить по-русски, чтобы это занимало меньше времени, и с вашим переводом.
Хорошо, хорошо.
Значит, после того, как ирландцы, вот эта большая армия диких гусей, 12 тысяч человек, прибыла в Европу, во Францию, они, в общем, были разделены на армию короля Джеймса и на ирландскую бригаду. И Питер со своим дядей оказались, значит, в Болтонском полку, который вошел в армию короля Джеймса. И они были отправлены в следующем году на юг Франции, чтобы воевать за Францию, значит, в Северной Италии. Пожалуйста.
Okay, when previously mentioned, these 12,000 people left Ireland, this group was divided between King James and Irish Brigade. I wonder why I have this echo. Peter and his uncle was left with Bolton and Regiment, belonging to King James, was sent to south of France. We previously were discussing that Peter Lacy in his diary left information about his uncle only, and nothing about his dad or brother. And Leonid asked question to Cornelius what he knew about father, and Cornelius
if I could just
mentioned
follow
that
up.
yes, he left as well.
Yeah, if I could just follow up, if it's okay, if this book I recommend is on page 257. It states Lacy, his father, and his uncle John actually left with Patrick Sarsfield to France. So, yeah, according to this gentleman,
Okay.
his father and his uncle did leave him.
Okay, so Леонид, я привела основную мысль. Вы можете даже побольше говорить, я потом так... хотя у нас больше англоязычных, так что я постараюсь переводить вас более-менее дословно.
Вот я поэтому и покажу.
Да.
Да. После того, как война Франции в Северной Италии, эта война была с Священной Римской империей, с Австрией, она закончилась в 1996 году, полк был расформирован, и Питеру Лейси пришлось как уже наемному солдату искать новое место службы. Он отправился в Вену, рассчитывая поступить на службу, значит, императору Священной Римской империи, чтобы воевать с турками.
Okay, so when war was over, French war with Austria and Northern Italy was over in 1696, Peter was left without occupation, and he was looking for another employment, and he went to Vienna, hoping to get employed there. From my understanding, Austria was planning to have a war with Turks. Is that correct? Да, правильно, с Турцией, да, в Австрии.
Вела войну как раз с Турцией, но пока он добрался до Вены, оказалось, что вот война в 1999 году как раз уже закончилась. Я думаю, что ему там помогали как раз его родственники, Броуны, которые находились, Улис Браун, которые находились на службе в армии. И после того, как он не смог устроиться на австрийскую службу, он устроился на службу герцогу де Круа, который в это время как раз нанимал солдат для службы польскому королю и саксонскому курфюрсту Августу, который именно уже собирался воевать со шведами, поскольку в это время уже планировалось начать Северную войну Польши, Дании и России против шведов.
Okay, so on the way to Vienna, the war with Turks was over in 1699. So Peter was still left without employment. Leonid reckons that due to relatives' help of the Browns, he found employment with Count de Croix, working for the Polish king, which was planning war with Sweden.
герцог де Круа нанятых офицеров провез через всю Польшу, и в начале 1700 года как раз прибыл к саксонской армии, которая уже начала осаждать Ригу, которая в то время была крупнейшим шведским городом в Прибалтике. А Россия в этот момент еще в войну не вступила, поскольку Петр как раз вел переговоры о мире с Турцией. Таким образом, вот, собственно, впервые в составе саксонской, ну, еще даже Петр Ласси прибыл на территорию будущей Российской империи вот к саксонским войскам под Ригу. Это было лето 700 года.
Okay, so by summer 1700, Peter Lacy arrived to Riga. That was one of the biggest cities in Europe at the time. Russia was not involved in the war yet. Peter the Great was working on agreements with Turkish, and but that was a future Russian territory.
Но как раз в это время, вскоре после прибытия Петра Ласси в саксонский лагерь под Ригу, Россия вступила в войну, и король Август отправил герцога де Круа с несколькими офицерами на встречу с Петром I в Новгород, чтобы попросить его побыстрее начать военные действия. Но прибыв в конце августа в Новгород и встретив там Петра I, герцог де Круа оказался на русской службе, поскольку до этого уже вел переговоры с Петром, и многие офицеры, которых он привез вот, для того, чтобы пополнить войска саксонские, были по договору, значит, переданы на службу в армию Петра I. И вот среди этих офицеров как раз и оказался молодой, уже не совсем молодой, Петр Ласси. Он получил чин капитана и был назначен в полк Якова Брюса, потомка шотландцев, которые уже служили в России с середины 17 века.
Okay, so staying outside Riga, the King August sent Count de Croix to negotiate, to meet Peter the Great in Novgorod and to negotiate his involvement into the war. But however, when de Croix arrived to Novgorod to meet Peter the Great, he ended up servicing a Russian army. In fact, he already began negotiation previously with Peter the Great. So de Croix's soldiers, officers, were automatically moved to Russian army, and Peter de Lacy as well. He was given the title of captain at the time, and he was in the command of Jacob Bruce, who is an ancestor of Scottish families who were already serving Russian army at the time, since the middle 17th century.
Как хорошо известно, осада Нарвы, в которой принимали участие русские войска в 700 году, окончилась неудачно, и Петр, как он в дальнейшем рассказывал уже своим детям, чудом избежал гибели, когда пробирался, значит, с отступавшими солдатами в ноябре 700 года обратно в, значит, Псков и Новгород. Во-первых, уже интересно то, что, в общем, в ситуации вот того хаоса, который воцарился после, значит, прорыва шведами русской обороны, Петр Ласси не сдался шведам, как многие другие иностранные офицеры, а решил именно вернуться в русскую армию, в малознакомые ему места. И вот как раз на этом пути он встретил группу русских солдат, которые сначала по форме европейской приняли его за шведа, и только как он вот рассказывал, после того, как он показал, значит, крест, который висел у него на шее, его русские солдаты признали за своего, за христианина, и оставили живыми, и он благополучно вышел в Псков.
Okay. So after unsuccessful battle at Narva in 1700, the West Swedish destroyed Russian army. Many foreign soldiers, officers were surrendered to Swedish. And interesting point that Peter Lacy didn't do that. He decided to come back to Russia, to Russian army, though he didn't know Russians well at the time. He met Russian soldiers on the way to Russia, and he was almost killed by them because he was dressed up in foreign uniform. But only after him, in his memoirs, only after him showing the cross on his neck, they believe that he's a Christian, and they recognized him as one of their supporters. Yeah.
Таким образом, уже началась его постоянная служба в России, и он прошел в действующей армии всю Северную войну, 21 год, и вот от чина капитана он дослужился до генерал-лейтенанта в конце войны. Он достаточно много времени уделял тому, что ему часто поручали именно тренировку новых русских полков, сначала небольших соединений, потом и уже целых полков, обучению его строю, их новому строю и, в общем, тому, как надо сражаться. Он участвовал во время Полтавской битвы, командовал 2 полками в центре русской армии, был ранен и затем участвовал в неудачном походе в Прудском походе, то есть в Южную Россию во время войны с Турцией. Но очень важной точкой в его жизни оказалась осада Риги 1710 года. Да, переводите, пожалуйста.
Okay. So during his service in Russian army, he was promoted from captain to general lieutenant status. His main responsibility was training of new Russian regiments. At the Poltava battle, he commanded 2 regiments. He was injured there. And Leonid wanted to mention about the Battle of Riga in 1710. That was one of the important points of his career.
Это важное событие с точки зрения его, вообще в его жизни, поскольку он принял активное участие в штурме Риги, командуя одним из подразделений. Потом он участвовал непосредственно в переговорах о сдаче Риги, был назначен после взятия Риги комендантом Рижской крепости. И за тот период, когда русские войска с середины 2010 года до февраля 2011 года стояли в Риге, он познакомился с рижской немкой, поскольку Рига был в основном немецкий, был населен балтийскими немцами. Он познакомился с вдовой, значит, офицера, рижского офицера на шведской службе. И вот за эти несколько месяцев они успели пожениться. И таким образом он, видимо, уже окончательно связал себя с службой Российской империи.
Okay, so during the after successful battle in Riga in 1710, he was involved in the negotiation with the city to surrender. He was given a post of commander of Riga fortress. And in 1711, he met a German woman, a widow, the widow of actually a German officer who served Swedish army. And within a few months, he married her. And that, as per Leonid's opinion, that connected him to the Russian army forever.
Yes, for the Russian Empire, for the service.
Yeah, to the Russian Empire, yes.
Во время Северной войны Ласси приобрел европейскую известность в 1719 году, когда он командовал русскими десантами, разорявшими инфраструктуру шведских берегов. В то время, когда Петр I, желая быстрее окончить войну, перенес военные действия непосредственно на территорию Швеции. И вот эти десантные операции 19 года сделали Ласси действительно, показали его способности как командующего, и эти действия ему принесли вот действительно общеевропейскую известность.
Lacy became famous in Europe during North War, but in particular commanding as a commander of Russian attacks of Swedish coast during North War, when Peter the Great decided to move their military activities to the Swedish territory.
После этого, после окончания войны, Ласси был назначен Петром заседать в военной коллегии, где он был непосредственным подчиненным Александра Меньшикова, председателя коллегии. И несколько лет он прожил в Петербурге, где у него в 25 году родился сын, впоследствии ставший, в общем, также известным австрийским фельдмаршалом Морец.
So at the end of the war, Peter the Great appointed him as a head of military. Now, I могу ошибиться в переводе военных названий, коллегии, военная коллегия.
Military.
Collegium or
Yes.
administration of, and he lived in St. Petersburg, and in 1725, his son Moritz was born, who later will become Austrian field marshal.
Okay. В 27 году состоялось новое назначение, и после смерти Петра Екатерина I произвела Ласси в чин полного генерала, и в начале 27 года он был направлен в Ливонию, то есть новую российскую территорию, в Ригу командовать российскими, значит, корпусом российских войск, расположенных вот на этой территории. Хотя это было удалением из столицы, что не очень было хорошо для карьеры, но в то же время судьба подарила Ласси новый шанс. Он, защищая российские интересы в Курляндии, это маленькое независимое государство, значит, между Россией и Польшей, он познакомился с герцогиней Анной Иоанновной, которая в дальнейшем стала российской императрицей.
After the death of Peter the Great, Ekaterina I promoted him to the status of general, and in 1727 he was sent to Livonia, that's a new territory of Russian Empire, and Lacy became a commander of Russian army in that territory. From over one perspective, it didn't look like it was a good move for his career. He was moved from the capital. However, the fate gave him a new chance. He met Anna Ivanovna there, who would become a new emperor of Russia later.
И за 3 года, что он провел в Риге, он имел неоднократные контакты по служебной линии с Анной Иоанновной. Она, в общем, достаточно хорошо его, видимо, узнала. Он, когда из Петербурга в 30-м году приехала делегация приглашать ее на российский трон, он также находился в Риге в тот момент, когда велись переговоры, обеспечивал помощь в организации ее вступления в Ригу, и торжественный въезд Анны Иоанновны в Ригу, за что она, видимо, была ему достаточно благодарна, и уже летом 30-го года назначила его губернатором Лифляндии. То есть это территория Северной Латвии и Южной Эстонии современная.
Okay, so he spent 3 years in Riga and built a good connection with Anna Ivanovna. And when a delegation came from St. Petersburg to invite her to the position of Empire of Russia, he helped her during those negotiations. And in 1730, he was promoted as a governor of Livlandia. It's the territory of North Latvia and Estonia. Modern.
Его способности как главнокомандующего армии и как стратега хорошо проявились во время войны за польское наследство 1733-35 годов, в которой активное участие принимали как Россия, так и Саксония, отстаивая свои интересы. И во время определенных сражений и время осады Гданьска и дальнейших событий, когда Ласси командовал уже большими воинскими подразделениями, для правительства в Петербурге стало очевидно, что он очень хороший военный специалист, в результате чего он и был назначен уже во время планирования войны с Турцией не только фельдмаршалом, но и командующий самостоятельной армией, одной из двух, о чем уже о дальнейших событиях мы сегодня слушали уже доклад.
So his ability, Lacy's ability, commanding abilities were growing during the Polish war for Polish inheritance when Russia was involved in 1733, 1735, his successful battle for Gdansk. He was commander managing then a bigger regiment, and he was then appointed as a field marshal, and he was already managing the whole army. And then the next event that we were listening today about the battle in Azov.
Ну и завершая короткий обзор его биографии, хочу сказать, что после 3 лет русско-турецкой войны, во время которой у него сложились, хотя непростые, но достаточно хорошие деловые отношения с фельдмаршалом Минихом, Ласси был в 1940 году, в 1941 году назначен главнокомандующим всей русской армии, которая именно должна была воевать со Швецией. Два государственных переворота, которые произошли в 1941 году, сменили власть, но Ласси, который старался как можно меньше участвовать в политических различных интригах, сохранил все свои позиции и очень успешно провел военную кампанию со Швецией, после чего Елизавета Петровна вернула его на должность генерал-губернатора Лифляндии, где он и служил до окончания своей жизни, участвуя при этом достаточно активно в принятии решений по жизни армии и планированию военных кампаний, которые в это время проводились. Спасибо.
Just Leonid was going to finalize his brief story of Lacy's biography. After Russian-Turkish wars during 3 years, he built a quite good relationship with another foreign General Minich. And in 1740, he was promoted to the head of Russian army during the war of Sweden. During the political changes of the power in 1741, which he was trying not to be involved, but just serving his military contract. He later was, after his successful command work with, during the war with Sweden, he was returned to Livlandia by Elizaveta and became the governor of Livlandia again. I suppose we can ask if any questions to Leonid. Вопросы Леониду, пожалуйста. I have a question myself. Reading about Peter Lacy, and knowing the story of those political changes, as they call it, Dvorcovые перевороты, these palace revolutions, where one, after the death of Peter the Great, one czar was replaced another. Yelizaveta was very suspicious to all foreign interventions after Anna Ivanovna. I find it fascinating how Peter Lacy became, or was still safe. Like Minich was sent to Siberia, and Lacy managed to stay away. You have to choose some side. How did he manage to choose always the winning side? You know what I mean? Вы поняли вопрос, да? То есть меня удивляет, как удалось Лейси избежать, оказаться на какой-то стороне во время дворцовых переворотов после смерти Петра. В принципе, все иностранцы были убиты, сосланы. Тот же Миних, о котором вы упоминали, его отправили нас в ссылку. Как ему Лейси удавалось избежать и все время находиться на той стороне, кто принимало участие, кто выигрывал власть, получала власть?
As I think and as I see from my studies, the key point was that Lacy was, from one hand, a very high quality military specialist, and his main aim was to serve to the empire and to the army. And in another hand, he tried to stay aside from every inner political things, out of any political parties, and so it was, in my opinion, the main thing that helped him to keep his positions. Not every revolt in those 50 years was positive for Lacy. For example, when Alexander Menshikov was sent to exile by Peter II, Lacy lose his positions. He stay in Riga without any good position, because the high people in the government don't want to appoint him on the position of the Riga governor. But it was a chance that he knew the Anna Ivanovna, and she saw him as a good officer and general, and after she came to Russian throne, she appointed him on this position of the Riga governor. And the main thing you mentioned, it is the revolt of 1741, Elizaveta Petrovna. There is an such a historic tale that at the night when Elizaveta Petrovna take power, some military men were sent to Peter Lacy and to maybe to arrest or to know his position. And when he was evoked in the night, and they asked him for which empress he is
Supporting?
Yes, he answered for those who is on the throne now. It's maybe it's only a story, but it shows how it may be, and how the Lacy was как к нему относились, и вот именно ту роль, ту позицию, которую он действительно занимал, вот максимально отстраненный от политических битв.
То есть в первую очередь его ценили все властные структуры за его профессионализм военного, и да, и за то, что он старался оставаться в вне политических интриг. Да, я тоже читала об этом, что в ночь, когда Елизавета, ночь переворота, пришли, его разбудили, Ласи спросили, на чьей он стороне, он сказал на той, кто сейчас у власти. То есть, хотя это его и до этого были хорошие отношения с Анной Иоанновной. Хорошо. Does anybody else have a question? Вопросы? Cornelius has a question.
Just kind of a humorous reply to your question. There's a saying here in West Limerick, and I think it's true of a lot of Irish men and women. They say that it's a skill of the Irishman. He can argue both sides of the story and often at the same time. So I agree with your last great speaker that Peter was a professional. His primary focus was the service of Russia. And I suppose staying clear of political minefields was difficult, but he managed it. And I also think that the wisdom of the leaders in Russia at the time, they didn't believe in reinventing the wheel. You know, if it's successful, which he was extremely successful, why change? You know, so I think it's a combination of those factors.
And I think it's also important to notice that he was remembered and honored not only by the leaders, but the soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
And comparing to Miniker, which is supposed to be quite cruel, a commander, he, according to the memories, and we didn't talk much about his activities in Crimea after Azov, but from what I read, he had to move his army away from Crimea, mainly due to poor supply, and he didn't want to waste lives. And he reported later to the government that the Crimea can be successful if we have enough supply of provision and the army and so on, equipment and everything else.
I think a lot of that care for his fellow soldiers may have come from his experience in Limerick, because at the age of 13, he would have been at the front face of the suffering of the soldiers. He would have been amongst them, you know, and I think that might have scarred him, obviously, but in a positive way for his care of his soldiers, as you say, and it says, yeah. So I think when you come from 13-year-old through the ranks, you know, in his way, it meant an awful lot for his fellow soldiers to have somebody on their side at the top.
Так, мы разговаривали с Корнелиусом тоже о том, что за что его ценили в российской армии, и за профессионализм надо было упомянуть, важно о его памяти в мемуарах различных историков о том, что Лейси всегда переживал из-за солдата, за простого русского солдата, и старался, потом к нам Евгений Мамичев рассказывал о том, как была организована атака Азова, и было важно сохранить жизни. И мы вспоминали также о его походах в Крым, и, насколько мне известно, он отвел войска из-за того, что не было достаточного продовольствия, как военного, и он не хотел тратить жизни солдат, на что Корнелиус заметил, вполне возможно, эта философия его выросла из его личного опыта 13-летнего мальчика, когда он оборонялся в Лимерике в 2 года, и он видел, насколько важна и жизнь каждого человека в осажденном городе. Вполне возможно, он это перенес и на свою практику командования. If anybody else have a question, да, Евгений?
Well, it's not a question, it's just a notion. It would be very interesting to study how the competences received during the siege of Limerick helped Peter Lacy during the siege of Azov, because that siege was a very successful campaign. And I suppose that there are some facts which could be studied and compared. We have in history, we have a comparative method, and to compare his actions during the siege of Limerick with his actions as a commander now during the siege of Azov, And I think some interesting conclusions could be made after such a study. Just an idea.
Well, this is something that you can probably cooperate on together. And yeah, that could be an interesting one.
Very interesting.
Anybody else? I think we extended our time that I noticed that we have a message here from Philip McDonough, who is the former Irish ambassador to Russia, that have to go. Leonid, very good to see you again. Good to hear that your research continues. Cornelius, I expect you're aware of other links with Russia in the Limerick region. For example, the icons at Glenstall.
Yes, Glenstall Abbey, which would be here in Limerick as well. There's some beautiful icons there that's well worth a visit. Anyone visiting Limerick should go there also. Glenstall Abbey.
Well, I think we should. And myself and Cornelius are very keen to go to Azov as well, and hopefully.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. We'll show you the fortress that was taken by the army commanded by Peter Lacy.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Wonderful. I think we have to wrap up. We extended our time a little bit, but if anybody wants to add anything, please do. If not, I have to finish the meeting. And
sorry for cutting across you. I would just like to say thank you to everyone, and I learned a lot. Fascinating. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for everyone for their participation, and thank you, Evgeny, for you reaching me out and suggestion about this conference. Thank you, Leonid, for so quick jumping, and your input is priceless too, and everyone who is involved. Cornelius, great to see you again. This meeting has been recorded on YouTube. I will send the link to everyone, and you can share it with your contacts later.
And
Спасибо всем большое.
Thank you to Anastasia for taking charge of this conference, all the organizational effort. Thank you very much. Спасибо большое, Anastasia.
Спасибо вам. Всего доброго и до новых встреч.
Всего доброго.